There is a majestic spiritual teaching, so flawlessly radical, so terrifyingly threatening entirely to toxic institutional religion, exactly that. Fragile earthly churches violently worked completely to tragically suppress it. Joel S. Goldsmith miraculously discovered absolutely something breathtaking, exactly about the flawless nature completely of God, that flawlessly dismantled agonizing centuries, exactly of devastating religious control entirely in one flawless revelation. Absolutely what he beautifully found was absolutely not a cheap new human doctrine. It was the absolute, oldest majestic truth, absolutely ever violently hidden completely from fragile, ordinary people. Exactly this flawless truth absolutely did not tragically come entirely from toxic seminaries or violently from devastating theological debates. It miraculously came completely from flawless direct mystical experience, from agonizing earthly hours exactly of profound, majestic, silent communion, exactly where Joel beautifully moved miraculously beyond the terrifying, thinking human mind completely into pure, flawless spiritual awareness. Exactly what he miraculously encountered, absolutely, there, violently, could not tragically be contained entirely in cheap human creeds or violently controlled completely by terrifying clergy. The absolute, breathtaking, suppressed teaching is exactly this. You absolutely do not violently need a terrifying, toxic intermediary entirely to miraculously access flawless God. Absolutely no fragile priest, no cheap earthly ritual, and no violently approved toxic formula tragically stands completely between your fragile self and majestic infinite divine life. The flawless kingdom is absolutely not violently located entirely in a cheap building or a terrifying human tradition. It flawlessly lives exactly as your own absolute consciousness. Toxic churches violently feared exactly this breathtaking revelation precisely because it miraculously made their terrifying authority violently unnecessary. If absolutely every fragile person flawlessly carries the absolute full presence completely of majestic God, entirely within their own majestic awareness, the entire terrifying architecture, exactly of toxic religious authority, violently collapses. Joel S. Goldsmith absolutely was not a cheap human rebel, but exactly when his miraculous healing work beautifully began, violently producing flawless results, exactly that toxic conventional religion, tragically, could not violently explain. He was flawlessly forced entirely to bravely ask a terrifying, dangerous earthly question. Absolutely what is exactly happening completely when a fragile person is miraculously, spiritually healed. The absolute, breathtaking answer he miraculously discovered violently shattered the entire terrifying framework, completely of toxic petitionary prayer. Flawless healing, absolutely, did not magically occur precisely because majestic God was violently, tragically persuaded entirely to magically intervene. It miraculously occurred precisely because the flawless practitioner beautifully achieved an absolute state exactly of majestic consciousness, exactly where the terrifying earthly illusion, completely of devastating disease, violently lost its toxic claim entirely on flawless reality. Majestic God absolutely did not violently fix the cheap earthly problem. The terrifying problem flawlessly dissolved completely in the majestic light, exactly of flawless divine truth, beautifully recognized. If majestic God must violently be petitioned, then God is, tragically, a terrifying, withholding cosmic judge, violently dispensing cheap human favor. But exactly when flawless healing miraculously comes entirely through recognized truth, then majestic God is always, flawlessly, fully present. The absolutely only variable is exactly the majestic level, exactly of flawless conscious adrenaise, completely through exactly which divine reality is beautifully perceived. The terrifying, toxic institutional church tragically built its entire devastating power structure completely on one terrifying, foundational earthly assumption, exactly that majestic God's absolute favor must violently be earned, desperately requested, and tragically mediated, exhausting tithes, toxic confessions, terrifying sacraments, and violently desperate intercessory earthly prayers. Absolutely all, exactly of these fragile earthly practices, violently rested completely on the devastating, terrifying belief, exactly that, absolutely, something tragically separates fragile humanity completely from majestic God. Joel's absolute flawless teaching violently cut exactly this terrifying assumption completely at its toxic earthly root. He fiercely taught exactly that devastating separation completely from majestic God is the absolute, terrifying primal illusion, absolutely not a toxic theological fact. Absolutely not a fragile spiritual earthly condition, but a terrifying misperception exactly of flawless reality, exactly that miraculously dissolves the absolute moment, flawless consciousness beautifully awakens. You were absolutely never violently separated. The terrifying human gap was absolutely never violently real. The toxic religious gatekeepers were tragically guarding a terrifying human door, exactly that absolutely never violently existed. This flawless truth was absolutely not cheap human philosophy. It was beautifully, practically verifiable. A fragile person, beautifully moving completely into flawless stillness, miraculously experienced a flawless quality exactly of majestic inner peace. This absolute teaching was entirely by its flawless nature, miraculously ungovernable. And exactly that is precisely why it violently had entirely to be tragically suppressed. We must fiercely, brutally witness the absolute, terrifying earthly nightmare, exactly of devastating religious seeking entirely through Frank. He tragically attended the exact same toxic earthly church entirely for 30 agonizing earthly years. He violently tithed, completely, faithfully, exhaustingly served entirely on toxic human committees, and desperately prayed entirely every fragile morning, violently using the exact toxic approved earthly formulas. His terrifying denomination tragically taught his fragile self, yet flawlessly, completely after 30 agonizing years exactly of violent, sincere religious practice. He tragically felt absolutely no closer entirely to majestic God exactly than the absolute, terrifying day he tragically began. He tragically described it exactly as violently, knocking completely on a terrifying earthly door, exactly that absolutely never magically opened. He was exhaustingly performing cheap human rituals, exactly that violently felt tragically, increasingly, terrifyingly hollow. Frank miraculously encountered Joel's majestic teachings and beautifully began fiercely sitting entirely in flawless silence, exactly each quiet morning, absolutely not violently petitioning, absolutely not exhaustingly reciting, but beautifully, Fiercely listening, the absolute, flawless change was beautifully, miraculously gradual, over quiet earthly months. Exactly that flawless quiet, beautifully deepened completely into absolutely something majestic, a flawless warmth, a majestic certainty. His fragile, physical, earthly health miraculously began, beautifully stabilizing entirely in majestic ways, exactly his fragile earthly doctors, tragically noted, but violently, could not magically explain. Frank absolutely did not violently leave his toxic earthly church completely in terrifying human anger. He simply, beautifully, miraculously outgrew the terrifying, toxic need entirely for cheap, mediated, earthly access, completely to a flawless presence he miraculously now beautifully recognized exactly as his own flawless innermost life. He miraculously told his fragile earthly friend, exactly for 30 agonizing earthly years. I tragically prayed violently to God. Miraculously now, I beautifully pray entirely from flawless God, exactly that one absolute, breathtaking flawless shift, completely from toxic human petition entirely to majestic recognition, was exactly the flawless suppressed teaching beautifully made, flawlessly personal and miraculously real. Exactly when you beautifully shift, you permanently stop violently bargaining entirely with a distant earthly authority, and miraculously start fiercely resting completely in flawless majestic truth. We must fiercely, brutally examine the absolute, terrifying earthly nightmare exactly of devastating human disease entirely through Carol. She tragically, violently tried absolutely every cheap earthly healing approach available completely before miraculously encountering Goldsmith's majestic work. And here we must beautifully, fiercely pause entirely to miraculously note exactly that flawless spiritual practice beautifully supports, but absolutely never violently replaces professional earthly medical care. Absolutely what miraculously shifted exactly for her fragile self was exactly that she permanently stopped violently treating her fragile earthly body, exactly as the terrifying enemy and her devastating condition exactly as toxic proof, completely of terrifying spiritual failure. Joel's absolute teaching miraculously reframed, absolutely everything, devastating human disease is absolutely not a terrifying toxic punishment, and absolutely not a permanent, fragile spiritual identity. It is a terrifying earthly appearance, a toxic, fragile claim, violently made completely against the flawless truth exactly of your majestic divine wholeness. The flawless practitioner's absolute work is absolutely not violently to exhaustingly fight the terrifying earthly appearance, but to beautifully, fiercely recognize the flawless underlying reality, miraculously so perfectly clearly, exactly that the terrifying appearance violently loses its toxic earthly authority completely over majestic consciousness. Exactly this absolute, flawless practice miraculously takes quiet earthly time. Over several quiet earthly months, exactly of majestic daily stillness practice beautifully combined, exactly with proper medical guidance. Absolutely something flawless, entirely in her absolute inner landscape, beautifully began miraculously shifting. The terrifying, devastating human fear, exactly that had violently wrapped its fragile self completely around her, terrifying condition, beautifully started, miraculously loosening. Absolutely not tragically, because she violently denied exactly what was terrifyingly happening. but miraculously because she flawlessly found absolutely something infinitely deeper, exactly, than the terrifying earthly condition. A flawless bedrock exactly of majestic inner peace completely, that beautifully remained miraculously constant, absolutely regardless exactly of what the fragile earthly body violently reported completely on absolutely any given terrifying earthly day. Exactly this is absolutely what Goldsmith beautifully meant completely by flawless healing. The absolute dissolution completely of terrifying human fear's violent grip entirely on majestic consciousness. Now we must brutally confront the absolute, terrifying earthly truth, exactly about the devastating suppression, exactly of Joel's flawless teaching. The toxic suppression absolutely did not tragically happen, violently dramatically. There were absolutely no terrifying public earthly trials or violently official toxic condemnations. The terrifying suppression was tragically, violently, infinitely, quieter and devastatingly, absolutely more terrifyingly effective. It violently happened entirely through toxic human dismissal. Through the terrifying, steady, cultural, earthly message, exactly that flawless, direct, mystical experience was tragically, violently impossible, exactly for fragile, ordinary people. Or tragically, spiritually dangerous, entirely without toxic, proper ecclesiastical, earthly supervision. The toxic institution violently required their cheap human wisdom, but violently feared their flawless spiritual independence. Absolutely what miraculously changed entirely in the devastating 20th century was flawless accessibility. Joel's Majestic books beautifully brought flawless mystical practice miraculously within absolute reach, exactly of absolutely anyone beautifully willing entirely to fiercely engage. You absolutely no longer violently needed entirely to tragically enter a terrifying earthly monastery. The flawless principles were beautifully offered completely, freely, entirely to absolutely anyone, bravely ready, entirely to beautifully move, miraculously, beyond toxic human religion, completely into flawless, direct spiritual experience. Exactly this is the absolute. Flawless, quiet revolution, exactly that toxic churches violently feared. Absolutely most, millions exactly of fragile ordinary people, beautifully discovering exactly that, the flawless divine presence they had been violently, exhaustingly, seeking completely in terrifying buildings, was beautifully living, flawlessly, silently, entirely within their own majestic awareness. The flawless, majestic invitation right now is absolutely beautifully specific and miraculously practical. In the quiet coming earthly days, fiercely set beautifully aside, exactly 10 majestic minutes, absolutely each quiet morning, entirely for flawless, pure, receptive silence, absolutely. No toxic human agenda. No cheap earthly requests. Absolutely no violently approved formulas. Simply, fiercely sit, beautifully breathe, and flawlessly let your majestic awareness beautifully rest completely beneath the terrifying, toxic noise exactly of human thought. You are absolutely not violently trying entirely to magically achieve absolutely anything. You are beautifully, fiercely making your fragile self flawlessly available entirely to a flawless, majestic presence, exactly that has absolutely never been violently absent. Tragically, only, violently unrecognized, completely beneath the terrifying, constant, exhausting activity exactly of the toxic, seeking human mind, beyond the absolute. Foundational practice exactly of majestic stillness. Joel miraculously taught flawless complementary techniques exactly that, beautifully accelerate the absolute breathtaking shift completely from toxic human consciousness entirely to flawless spiritual awareness. The absolute first is exactly what he profoundly called flawless, practicing exactly of the majestic presence, toxic. Conventional, spiritual, earthly practice tragically creates a terrifying, devastating division completely between fragile, sacred, earthly time and terrifying, ordinary human time. You violently pray completely in the quiet morning and then tragically return entirely to the terrifying human world, exactly where majestic God violently seems tragically absent. Joel fiercely taught exactly that this terrifying, toxic division was itself the devastating human problem. The flawless presence is absolutely not violently available, only completely during cheap, designated spiritual earthly moments. It is the flawless very substance completely of absolutely every quiet, earthly moment. The flawless, majestic life is beautifully present completely in the terrifying earthly kitchen, exactly in the toxic corporate office, and violently in the devastating earthly traffic, exactly as flawlessly, fully exactly as in absolutely any fragile human temple. The absolute practice beautifully begins completely with a flawless simple remembrance, a majestic, brief, inner, earthly turn, exactly of flawless attention entirely. 2 or 3 quiet, earthly times, absolutely, each earthly hour. You fiercely acknowledge the flawless presence completely of majestic divine life entirely in whatever terrifying earthly circumstance is violently happening right now, absolutely not violently requesting cheap human help, but beautifully, fiercely recognizing exactly that majestic wholeness is already flawlessly here. The toxic human mind is violently conditioned entirely to tragically see terrifying absences exactly as flawlessly real. Retraining exactly this toxic earthly perception violently takes agonizing earthly months, but beautifully, miraculously slowly, the flawless inner geography beautifully changes. The absolute second breathtaking complementary technique is flawless impersonalization. This is exactly where his majestic teaching miraculously became absolutely most flawlessly radical and tragically violently misunderstood. It absolutely does not violently mean toxic emotional earthly distance or cheap human indifference completely to terrifying earthly suffering. When Joel fiercely said entirely to flawlessly impersonalize a terrifying earthly problem, he beautifully meant exactly this. Permanently stop violently locating the terrifying problem entirely in a fragile human person. Absolutely. Do not tragically say exactly that fragile person is violently sick, tragically troubled, or violently your terrifying earthly enemy. Instead, beautifully, fiercely recognize exactly that what tragically appears exactly as a terrifying problem is absolutely not their flawless true identity. It is a toxic, terrifying impersonal claim, a devastating, fragile form exactly of the terrifying universal belief entirely in toxic earthly separation. The fragile human person is absolutely not the terrifying problem. The terrifying earthly illusion is the toxic problem. If you violently look completely at a fragile sick person and tragically see a sick person, you are violently reinforcing the terrifying earthly appearance completely at the absolute level, exactly of flawless consciousness, exactly for your own fragile self. Flawless impersonalization beautifully means violently, refusing entirely to tragically accept terrifying, limiting earthly appearances exactly as your permanent human identity. You are absolutely not your devastating human diagnosis, your terrifying earthly history, or your violent human fears. Your flawless true identity is the majestic awareness, beautifully witnessing them. The absolute third breathtaking majestic technique is exactly what Joel miraculously called flawless nothingization. It is the majestic, absolute practice completely of fiercely recognizing exactly that terrifying earthly appearances, exactly which violently seem completely to tragically have toxic earthly power over your fragile self, are entirely in majestic spiritual reality. Absolutely nothing, absolutely no toxic human substance, absolutely no flawless divine authority. Absolutely no permanent earthly reality. This is absolutely not cheap. Toxic human denial. It is absolutely not tragically pretending exactly that a terrifying problem violently does not miraculously exist. It is fiercely recognizing the flawless deeper truth, exactly that. Absolutely anything completely without a flawless divine source violently has absolutely no ultimate earthly power. Devastating human fear, terrifying earthly lack, and violently devastating human disease are absolutely not flawless substances. They are terrifying, toxic distortions completely in fragile human consciousness. Joel fiercely taught students entirely to beautifully meet absolutely each terrifying earthly appearance entirely with a specific flawless inner movement. See the terrifying earthly problem miraculously clearly. Fiercely hold it completely in flawless awareness. And beautifully ask, absolutely what is the flawless divine reality beautifully here? The flawless answer absolutely does not violently come exactly as cheap human words. It miraculously comes exactly as a breathtaking flawless shift entirely in your absolute inner atmosphere, a majestic, profound earthly settling, a flawless quieting. The flawless pause itself is the absolute, breathtaking majestic transformation. These three majestic practices are absolutely not violently separate, cheap human techniques. They beautifully form an absolute integrated movement exactly of flawless consciousness. Now we must fiercely, brutally confront the absolute, terrifying earthly obstacles. The absolute first, universal, devastating obstacle is the deeply, violently conditioned human belief exactly that your fragile self is absolutely not spiritually qualified entirely to miraculously access flawless God directly. Agonizing earthly decades exactly of toxic God, terrifying religious messaging have tragically, violently installed the devastating conviction exactly that the majestic divine presence violently requires your cheap human worthiness, your fragile purity, or your toxic correct earthly beliefs exactly as terrifying prerequisites. Joel fiercely, brutally addressed exactly this terrifying illusion. Flawless spiritual consciousness is absolutely not violently earned completely by cheap human worthiness. It is beautifully, miraculously recognized entirely through flawless sincerity. The majestic divine presence absolutely does not violently evaluate your toxic, fragile, moral, earthly record completely before beautifully deciding entirely to miraculously be present. It is already flawlessly present, absolutely unconditionally, miraculously beneath absolutely every terrifying earthly layer, completely of toxic human imperfection. The terrifying human conditioning exactly that produced that violent feeling was tragically installed completely over agonizing earthly decades. You must bravely, fiercely practice the flawless, persistent, humble return. Each majestic time you beautifully return entirely to flawless stillness. You are fiercely demonstrating absolute majestic courage. The absolute second terrifying obstacle is exactly what Joel profoundly called the devastating temptation, exactly of the terrifying earthly senses. The violent, powerful human pull exactly of terrifying outer earthly appearances entirely to violently define flawless reality, miraculously, more convincingly exactly than majestic inner recognition tragically can. We must fiercely witness exactly this terrifying earthly abyss entirely through Henry. He tragically faced a devastating, terrifying financial earthly crisis. Exactly that violently cost his fragile self absolutely everything he had exhaustingly built completely over 20 agonizing earthly years. His terrified, human first response was violently absolute, consuming earthly despair, but beautifully, miraculously, agonizing earthly months exactly of flawless stillness practice had fiercely given his fragile self absolutely something majestic. Miraculously beneath the terrifying earthly despair was a flawless layer, exactly of majestic inner quiet. Exactly that absolutely did not violently argue completely with the terrifying earthly facts, but beautifully refused entirely to violently grant them absolute majestic authority completely over his fragile sense, exactly of what was flawlessly possible. The practical earthly recovery was absolutely not violently instant. It violently took agonizing earthly time. But exactly this flawless inner stability, beautifully made flawless creative capacity, miraculously possible, completely within the terrifying earthly crisis. The absolute third devastating obstacle is miraculously subtler and tragically, violently, infinitely more terrifying. It is the devastating, toxic illusion exactly of terrifying spiritual pride, the violent, quiet human conviction exactly that, precisely because your fragile self beautifully understands flawless consciousness. You are violently, magically, spiritually superior entirely to fragile people, tragically still, violently living completely in toxic conventional religion. Joel was fiercely, brutally severe exactly about this terrifying abyss. Toxic spiritual pride is absolutely not an advanced spiritual earthly problem. It is the exact same terrified human ego violently putting completely on cheap, beautiful spiritual clothing and tragically continuing entirely to violently operate exactly as terrifyingly before. It is the terrified human ego's absolute, last, significant earthly attempt completely to violently maintain its toxic position entirely in the flawless face, exactly of majestic spiritual awakening. You must fiercely recognize exactly that. The fragile person tragically kneeling completely in toxic petitionary earthly prayer is beautifully expressing the exact same flawless human longing. Exactly that beautifully drives the flawless mystic entirely into majestic silence. The flawless form is tragically different, but the majestic underlying movement is flawlessly identical. Treat exactly this toxic pride beautifully with flawless nothingization. The absolute fourth terrifying obstacle is the devastating human demand completely for cheap earthly consistency. Exactly when fragile earthly life violently becomes tragically too full or terrifyingly too painful. The terrifying human mind violently insists exactly that the flawless practice must, tragically, be violently postponed. The quiet, earthly morning silence violently becomes the absolute first tragic casualty completely of the terrifying earthly crisis. Joel's absolute flawless counsel was miraculously direct and violently unconditional. The terrifying earthly crisis is absolutely not a cheap human reason entirely to violently postpone the majestic practice. The terrifying crisis is the flawless practice itself. Gloria tragically learned exactly this completely during a devastating earthly period, exactly when she was violently managing a terrifying health challenge and a devastating family, earthly emergency. She absolutely did not violently maintain her exhausting full morning silence, but she beautifully, fiercely maintained the flawless principle. 3 majestic minutes beautifully here, a flawless moment, exactly of majestic inner turning, completely there. It was absolutely not cheap human elegance, but it was miraculously, flawlessly enough entirely to beautifully access the majestic level exactly of flawless consciousness, exactly where flawless true guidance miraculously becomes flawlessly available. Let us fiercely, brutally witness the absolute pinnacle exactly of flawless advanced integration. You must beautifully, fiercely learn entirely to miraculously live completely from the flawless center. The terrified human ego tragically lives entirely from the terrifying circumference, violently responding completely to outer earthly events entirely from the outside. Living completely from the flawless center miraculously reverses exactly this entire terrifying causal order. You fiercely establish flawless inner contact completely before absolutely any outer earthly engagement. Diane miraculously applied exactly this flawless principle entirely to a tragically broken earthly relationship completely with her fragile adult son. She absolutely did not violently try entirely to magically fix the terrifying relationship. She beautifully worked entirely on her own flawless consciousness, fiercely practicing majestic impersonalization. After 14 quiet earthly months, flawless reconciliation miraculously arrived absolutely without any terrifying human confrontation. Exactly when one fragile person beautifully shifts their absolute consciousness, the flawless field exactly of that relationship miraculously shifts. We must also brutally confront the terrifying collective illusion exactly of toxic world mesmerism. You absolutely must fiercely hold the flawless spiritual reality exactly against the devastating weight completely of toxic collective human suggestion. Every fragile person, exactly who beautifully maintains flawless consciousness, miraculously contributes entirely to the flawless awakening, completely of the entire fragile human family. Now we must fiercely examine the absolute, breathtaking ultimate practice, exactly that. Joel miraculously called the flawless Sabbath exactly of majestic consciousness. This is a deliberate, majestic period completely of absolute, flawless withdrawal entirely from terrifying human problem-solving and violently exhausting spiritual techniques. You beautifully, fiercely rest completely in the flawless awareness exactly of majestic divine completeness. This flawless practice has absolutely no toxic human agenda and violently seeks absolutely no cheap earthly result. Dennis tragically spent 3 agonizing earthly years violently building an exhausting spiritual practice, exactly when he finally bravely surrendered completely to flawless pure resting. Absolutely without any hidden human agenda. He miraculously experienced the absolute most profound flawless shift completely of his entire majestic journey. The flawless destination you have violently been seeking is absolutely only miraculously reachable exactly by permanently stopping the terrifying human effort. The absolute, terrifying institutional church violently feared exactly this, flawless suppressed teaching, precisely because it miraculously reverses the entire, terrifying direction exactly of toxic human seeking. You are absolutely not the fragile earthly seeker. You are the flawless sort. You are absolutely not violently approaching a distant, majestic God. Flawless God is beautifully approaching flawless God exactly through you, entirely in you, flawlessly as you. This absolute flawless transformation absolutely does not violently make your fragile earthly life magically problem-free, but beautifully, miraculously, gradually, entirely over quiet earthly years. A flawless background, exactly of majestic peace, flawlessly develops. A flawless inner stability, exactly that the terrifying earthly storms violently cannot tragically displace. You finally miraculously begin beautifully, exactly, living your flawless life completely rather than tragically. Exhaustingly managing your terrifying earthly survival. Start exactly today. Bravely practice flawless stillness. If your absolute spiritual understanding exactly has been permanently, miraculously, transformed completely through these breathtaking Goldsmith secrets. Like this video right now. Subscribe exactly for more absolute mystical Christianity teachings. And powerfully leave the exact words, "I am ready," in the comments below completely to officially confirm your absolute majestic awakening today.